there were no schools for children. That's very different to the world we have today. Children didn't go to school. The main objective to being a child was to spend the time with your parents and enjoy growing up. Learn to socialize, learn the basics of life through osmosis. The benefit of this approach was wonderful for both child and parents. So the life of the young ones consisted of the first 20 years being with the parents, learning about life naturally, and it really was the happiest type of growing up imaginable. Parents were required to teach their children how to read and write, basic maths skills, basic technology skills, that is, how to use the devices of normal life, skills like critical thinking, a joy of learning and of questioning, as well as the usual play and socialization. But this was all done in an informal and entertaining way. By the way, parents had no other job or role during this time, as being a parent was their job, and a very respected job it was too. It was a bit like having 20 years of maternity or paternity leave. Some parents also taught their children things like music, agriculture, or the things that they were interested in, the things that were of interest to the family as a whole. Basically, they got a background in everything needed to start their formal education, plus whatever the parents were interested in. So that could be, well, anything from a love of animals through to philosophy, history, even primitive studies. There was no studying as such at this point, no stress, no demands for a certain level of achievement. It was just a natural form of learning and a beautiful experience. The first part of my childhood was before we moved to a whole new civilization. So that was before we moved to Tantal, Atlantis. I had regular dreams about a certain house that we lived in, and it was in a beautiful village on the edge of a lake. I think it was a lake, fresh water, so I assume a lake rather than a river. It was very sheltered, like a cove, with fairly steep hills in a semicircle. Anyway, it was a most unusual house in terms of the village that we lived in. The front of the house was wood, but the back was built into the hillside and included a high turret where Uran, my brother, my very famous brother, started doing his experiments. And that was, he started doing that before I was born. But when I was very young, I was not allowed up there because I was too young for that sort of thing. But once I reached about 10, Oren took an interest in me and would let me help. Help as in, as much as any 10-year-old could in fact help a genius with their experiments. But he made me feel like I was contributing. Anyway, I loved being with my brother. Everything seemed to be fun at that stage. It was joyous. The feelings that I had throughout that time, it was just a pleasure. It was also very interesting. I learned very rapidly from him. Of course, I wasn't in the same league as him intellectually, but I was smart enough to be useful, especially once I got older. When we moved to the new big city that Uran had created, it was very exciting. But I do remember expecting that I would return to the house one day, even though, we'd packed up and we left, and we did actually return there occasionally for the odd nostalgic holiday. The whole village, in fact, was kept up like a museum to where we kind of started out as a civilization. Anyway, we moved on to the main island, which I would have been about 13. I had visited the place, Atlantis, while it was being built many times with Uran. He explained all his reasons for why he chose the location and all the changes he did to it before we we were able to move over. Anyway, I deviate again. I do that, don't I? Back to my education. After the move, I spent most of my time with my parents, basically because Uran had his hands full finalising the setting up of his various universities. Then later, about 18-ish, I travelled with my parents and my brother to do experiments with plants. That was fun. Uran was a big part of my childhood because he was wonderful with me, and of course I had a famous brother, the genius who was profoundly changing our civilization. I was so proud of him. Essentially, he created tantal, and he made the scientific advancements that helped us as a civilization to progress and to eliminate old age so people could live indefinitely. Well, as long as no tragedy occurred, like an accident or getting attacked or some weird act of nature, Anyway, socialization with other children was done very naturally when I was growing up, but as our society progressed and there were less children, because of the one-child policy that came in, people actually had to travel to socialise their kids so that the groups of children of the right age could meet with each other. But that's a whole different story. And there were very specific events for this purpose. Anyway, back to education. Yes, parents wanted all their children, to have a happy childhood without being forced into formal types of learning. So the education was informal and osmotic. And in terms of my education, well, I spent it with my parents, and then at 20 years old, childhood ended and the formal education was to begin. So in my dream of this time, I was very excited to be starting on that path. I was fortunate to have absorbed a lot of knowledge because of my brother, and my parents had always treated me as a valued member of the family, like a real adult, with my own opinions and my own rights. I think compared to modern life today in the waking world, it's quite different, and it's no wonder teenagers rebel. They feel so powerless. Most importantly, before entering university, the young ones would learn how to think in a way to maximize their learning once they reach the formal environment. So that the things that were addressed were problem solving and making educated choices and working out truth from falsehood, etc. So once the time's come to be formally educated, there's a great big celebration. And then the young adult prepares to be living life quite differently. So becoming educated or knowing involves 10 years in each of the 12 universities or institutions. But if somebody didn't want to do this, they weren't forced into it. I mean, they could just take an ordinary role, like menial, but they would never achieve knowing. A few did do this because they had suffered some kind of limitations, but most of them did actually end up going to university eventually once those limitations had been addressed. So 3 of these institutions only were located in Atlantis, in the area called Tantal, and others were in various places around the world, including the Americas, Europe, Egypt, etc. There was a place for students to live in each institution, but often people continue to live with a parent or maybe a guardian, like a friend of the family, if the university was located where someone could act as a guardian. When I started my education, some of the universities were not yet decentralized. So what I mean by that was, some of them were still in the great university in Tental, and were in the process of finding a location for them. So I guess I was born and grew up through many of the changes that happened in those early days. So I did travel. My first 10 years were at the main university in Tental, and then I got the opportunity to travel to some of the other universities. I think there's there's a couple of episodes already where I'm at one of the various universities. So anyway, at the ripe young age of 140, we basically have finished our tour of the 12 institutions and are free to choose whether we want to return to an institution or to teach, or to do research in specific subject matters, or to hold a specific kind of role or job in society. So we get to choose that.